All right, welcome everybody to the October 1st, 2025 Transportation Coordinating Committee. Appreciate everybody coming today. First order of business that we have is the approval of the meeting minutes from our last meeting. Do I have has everybody had an opportunity to review those minutes? Are there any changes to be made? I'm hearing none. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, the minutes stand approved. Next, we have the opportunity for public comment. We have provided a hybrid option for those who aren't available to be here today. Any online participants can communicate in the chat. Do we have anybody here that would like to provide public comment? Hearing none, we will close the public comment portion, and that brings us on to the informational items. Informational item A is bicycle and pedestrian level of service and latent demand. Kayla Ferguson of Birch Transportation is going to be providing a presentation, I believe.
Hey, Michael Skipper. Yeah, sure. 1 second. Thanks, Daniel. So as Josh mentioned, I'm Kayla Ferguson with Birch Transportation. I'm one of the on-call consultants with GNRC, specifically helping the MPO with certain aspects of their RTP update. This is probably our third cycle is what I mentioned, helping the MPO update the bicycle pedestrian level service and the latent demand for non-motorized users. So Daniel had asked me to give a quick update on some of the efforts that we've done to date. I'll keep it pretty high level and answer questions at the end if needed. So starting first with the bicycle and pedestrian level service, again, this is something that we've done for 3 RTP cycles now. So the purpose of this analysis in the context of the RTP is to look at the comfort level and safety for people walking and people biking on the region's roadway. So this is for the 7-county MPO area. It is, again, this framework that is established in the Highway Capacity Manual. So for those of you who are familiar with the Highway Capacity Manual, it's a very nitty-gritty calculation, engineering based. We do the segment level analysis, not the intersection level. So those are 2 different things worth noting. And I think how this kind of fits into the RTP process is that, when projects come in through the call for projects, they're being prioritized, looking at those scopes, trying to compare that with the level of service outputs and seeing where improvements to the infrastructure for non-motorized users can be improved on those projects that are coming up for the fiscally constrained plan. So in terms of data and what this model requires, so we look at about almost 3,500 miles of the arterial and collector roadway system. I'll mention this in a minute, but we primarily do these calculations. They're very iterative and duplicative. So we do this with a Python script in a QGIS environment. So we could, in theory, do it for local roadways too. The problem is that there's a lot of data that's needed from an infrastructure standpoint, and that's not always readily available for local roadways. So in terms of data and what we need, the highway capacity equations take into account things like cross-section attributes, traffic attributes, and then many things related to the pedestrian and bikeway network. So from pedestrian standpoint, we have to have sidewalk width. We need to know whether or not there's a horizontal or a vertical buffer and the width of that along the roadway. We also need to know the presence of on-street parking and some traffic attributes, which we also need to know for bikeway facilities. For bicycle level service, we also have to know heavy vehicle percentages, which we source from TDOT's data, and posted speed is a huge contributing factor for the BLOS, as we call it. So we, again, have automated this procedure. So once we do the mostly heavy lift of collecting the inventory, it's a pretty quick calculation process, and it outputs the level service A through F, commonly, what you see with vehicular level of service too. So it is a little bit different than the level of traffic stress that you may have seen with some municipalities using. It's mostly based on cross-section and speed. I don't think you can see it because it's not full screen, but in terms of where we get this data, a lot of it's sourced from the TDOT eTrims network because they keep a pretty good inventory of their arterial and collectors. Again, not so great on the locals. We also look at the MPO travel demand model outputs. We use volume, speed, some cross-section attributes from there. We look at local GIS. So if any of you all have open data portals on your website, I probably pulled them, looking for specifically for sidewalks and bikeways and greenways and things like that. And then as a last resort, we use aerial imagery and field visits because there's a lot of places where aerial imagery is not up to date, where places are being are growing and developing quickly. So we have to go out and actually measure the sidewalk width. So what this translates into in terms of an output, again, is a level service grade A through F. This is for pedestrian that you see on the map. And the table itself shows the relative distribution between miles of the different letter grades. So as I mentioned, we've done this for 3, maybe 4 RTP cycles now, which gives us kind of an interesting longitudinal look of the arterial and collector roadway system in the region. So can't really see the key takeaway again on the bottom, but in general, pedestrian comfort on the arterials and collectors is actually improving across the region. I'll show you in a minute how that breaks down by county. I think most of this is due to the fact that sidewalks are a lot easier to construct compared to bikeways, which take right away from vehicles. And obviously, as some of our arterial and collector corridors are being redesigned, they're incorporating more pedestrian facilities, more separation from vehicles. And obviously, as development comes in, they are more often required to put in sidewalks compared to bike facilities. Conversely, on the other side of things have gotten worse for cyclists. With Davidson County being the oddball or the exception to that statement, generally speaking, most of our arterials and collectors have gotten less comfortable for cyclists. Probably not surprising to anyone. A lot of this, from what we can discern, is due to traffic. So the bicycle level service model is very sensitive to traffic volumes, especially truck volumes. So I think that, intuitively, as congestion gets worse on the interstate system, traffic diverts to arterials and collectors, which we've seen, across many counties. It gets less comfortable for cyclists. And again, there's not quite as much cycling network out there as there is pedestrian. So as it looks in terms of comfortable miles, so we've kind of called a level of service C or A or B, C or better, what we would call comfortable for someone walking or biking across the region. So these are parsed out by county. On the left is the walking. So this is the actual number of miles. The percentages are a little bit deceptive because the miles of arterial and collectors have changed or increased in the past 5 years. So with the exception of Robertson County, which has a very slight decrease, all the counties have increased their mileage of comfortable pedestrian facilities. And Davidson County seeing the highest number that you see on the far left of that graph. On the right is the biking. And with the exception of Davidson County again, which has obviously been putting forth a lot of effort in their protected bikeways and kind of retrofitting some of their existing collector roads, all the counties have seen a decrease in their miles of roadway that are comfortable for cyclists. So again, nothing too surprising, I don't think. In addition to the GIS files that we provide to the MPO for use in RTP and mapping purposes, there is like a really brief technical memo that kind of goes into a little bit more detail. It has more detail by jurisdiction. So if you're interested in that for any of your local jurisdictions, you can ask us or Daniel and he would provide it. So just key takeaways: cycling still kind of problematic. They compete with vehicles for right of way. So there's been less investment, I think, in terms of expanding the network across the region, with the exception of Davidson County. Pedestrian, it's getting better. Not surprising again, but this kind of is just one of the tools in the toolbox for evaluating bike ped facilities in the RTP and the project prioritization. So I'll save questions until the end if you have them, but I'll go ahead and switch gears into the latent demand. So this is yet another tool or model that we have, run and developed multiple RTP iterations. So every 5 years we do this again. And the intention of this tool is to look at the possibility for walking and biking trips to be made across the 7 counties again. And it's kind of a little bit more of like a higher level analysis as opposed to like a really nitty gritty one. It is still data hungry a little bit. So this is a parcel based analysis. So we use the parcel land use model that the MPO develops or GNRC develops for its travel demand model. We use those land use categories and things. So in this time around, that was about 715,000 parcels that we ran this analysis for. In terms of inputs, data-wise, we use the households, the number of jobs by sector. We use different demographic data related specifically to age, and schools, parks, transit, structured parking, things that where people would be making trips to or from. And then we also have to develop some distance. For every parcel, we have to calculate the minimum distance to these different trip destinations. And at the moment, the model to date has always used Euclidean distance. So as the crow flies, we could do a network distance. So, if you live in a cul-de-sac, it's obviously longer to walk somewhere than it is as the crow flies. But we haven't done that to date simply because of the processing time it takes to do that along a routable network in GIS. So the methodology, again, we did this one through scripting just because it makes it less error prone and able to be replicated in the future. So we modeled 7 trip purposes for walking and biking that I've listed up here. So trips for work, errands, shopping, recreation, school, to and from transit, and then also parking structures, because we know that intuitively parking structures in dense areas or just even in less dense but downtown areas generate walking trips. So the last thing that we had to do after curating all this trip origin destination data is we have to develop these decay functions. We use the National Household Travel Survey data. This time we used 2017. We tried to use the 2022 because we try to update it with the most recent survey sample data, but the survey sampling method for the 2022 data has changed. And so there's a lot fewer sample sizes in urban areas across the country. So we had to revert back to 2017, which was okay, but effectively we have to model how likely is someone to make a trip for a specific purpose via walking or biking based on its distance. So obviously the longer your distance gets, the less likely you are to make it by walking for sure, biking most of the time. The outputs, again, this is kind of like a higher level analysis, is somewhat of like a heat map to show you where we expect there to be a lot of potential for non-motorized trip making. It's pretty intuitive. Obviously, in your denser areas where you have a lot of mixes of land use, so trip origins and destinations in close proximity, we see that the patterns are pretty consistent with what we would expect. What's interesting though is that year over year, every cycle, so every 5 years, we've historically seen an increase in demand. Again, this is latent demand, so it's not actual realized trips. It's just kind of like what could be if the infrastructure were comfortable, everybody was willing to walk, or not everyone, but a decent portion, et cetera, et cetera. But what was interesting is this time around, we actually saw a decrease in the demand. And so when digging in a little bit, it mostly comes from the walking demand. And so typically our drivers for increased demand every RTP cycle are growth. Obviously, we have more people in the region. So, more people means more trips being made as a whole. But across the board, the average household size, and this is a household-based model, so the household size has decreased. So there are technically like less people per household making those trips. And then what we also found was that a lot of the growth that's happening across the region is not happening in those dense areas. It's happening farther out in more suburban, low density areas. And so those places just aren't conducive to walking and biking because they're farther away from trip destinations. So we didn't see the increase that we would expect. But again, because this is used at like a higher level, it wasn't really that concerning. Trips and potential for trips where we would expect. So the main use for this is kind of pairing where we think trips could happen with looking at, the bicycle and pedestrian level service and other more local network granularity to say, there's a lot of trips that could be made here, but people maybe aren't making them because there's not comfortable infrastructure. So how, from a policy planning or from a project prioritization standpoint, can we help, fix that incongruence? So I think that's it. Daniel said I had 10 minutes. I don't know how I did, but I'm happy to answer any questions now or after. I'm going to be hanging around for a little bit too. So go for it, Jonathan.
Question about the routing distances. So not using the actual on-network routing distance versus just using Euclidean.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that the processing power, because
Yeah.
I've done that kind of stuff, but so it's a pretty significant amount of time to have to run those models, especially the more information you're providing them. But has there been any maybe some effort done to take a smaller subset of that data to compare it by using the actual network distances. Because I can see that being a huge difference in how the level of service is going to come out.
Mhm.
With you actually using the actual network on the ground distances versus the Euclidean distances. Because especially, I'll just speak for Franklin, we have a lot of places where we'll have gaps in sidewalks. So if you're using the actual what it takes to walk or on a facility or bike on a facility where there's truly the ability to do so, there's a gap there.
Yeah.
So if you're just measuring as the crow flies might literally be across a stream, or it might be it might be across a ditch that you literally have to walk 2 miles to go around. So that's my concern there.
Yeah, we have not done that, but we are, as part of this work order, tasked with kind of looking at updates to this model. So one of the decisions we made at the beginning of this scope of work was that we wanted to keep this model the same as it was last time for comparability. But I think moving forward, the MPO and GNRC staff are interested in saying, like, okay, how can we improve this to be more realistic or to be just more useful in the planning process, or be useful to jurisdictions too. So I wrote it down because we have a meeting afterwards to talk about model enhancement. So doing a subset would be interesting to see. But
Okay,
you're 100% correct.
Questions for Caleb? Yes, sir. Felix?
Oh, yeah. So I think along those lines, and I know you guys look at bike ped facilities when you evaluate projects for the long range plan, but I wonder if this is understanding that, the latent demand, it's actually going down now, and because of some of the factors that you described, if this may play maybe a more prominent role in how you develop policy for evaluating those projects moving forward.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting results showing trends over time. I don't think we've gotten to the point where we're thinking have realized exactly how we're going to use that, but I'm really glad to see not just what the model produces, but start bringing in some of these trends. Say, is this the way we want it to go? If not, how do we mitigate it, or how do we produce better results through policy? So yeah, thank you for thinking about that.
I'm going to add to it. I think it's an interesting quandary because the MPO obviously doesn't control land use and or household size, but it's an interesting issue. How do they solve it with infrastructure versus like where development does or doesn't occur, which I think is probably where most of y'all come in.
So way to maybe even incentivize.
Yeah.
Not sure what the answer is, but yeah.
And one of the things that we were going to look at too, to again, the applicability is and kind of to your point too, Jonathan, about would someone actually walk? Because again, this is latent demand. So it's kind of like in a perfect world, there's a facility that connects, it's safe, it's comfortable. But I think we also kind of want to take it a step further, and instead of keeping these two analyses separate, to kind of look at some way of overlapping them to say, okay, great, the demand's here, but your BLOS, PLOS, or level of traffic stress score is so low that demand to be realized is pretty much factored down, So I think we're trying to figure out how the next steps for what these look like. So.
Yeah, I would say like in our Greenways master plan that we do, it's in our UPWP, that could say, hey, Euclidean distance shows demand for getting to that school from this neighborhood across the creek. I like the Euclidean distance because you can say there's a demand to get to that school. That's why the demand is high in that from that household. So the Greenway master plan could potentially say, let's recommend a bridge here or recommend a greenway here. That's one idea that we've had.
We've also we used this latent demand model one time in Knoxville. They had really great data that they were willing to share on actual student locations. Obviously it was anonymized, but we were able, to your point, taking a subset, and we looked at, within a 3-mile radius of every school, every kid that was actually zoned for that school, we mapped the actual network distance. And it was much more telling at a small scale because you could say, hey, here's a ton of people who are very close in a cul-de-sac, as an example, that just need a greenway through this easement. And it was much more useful on a smaller scale where we could route exactly to see what infrastructure is needed. To your point about greenway planning.
I do like the point Will mentioned about comparing the Euclidean distance, because you're finding the need there, people seeing a destination and from their origin, and then what does it actually take to get there physically.
Or did you have something?
Yes, I do. When do you anticipate that this might be available to local jurisdictions to help inform some of our long-range planning efforts?
I mean, typically, I think through the RTP process, all of the Tableau maps that are on the open data portal, I think they've always been available historically. I think the old one is on there right now. Oh, it is? Okay, great. Then it's already on the open data portal.
And then ETA on enhancements that you're going to be pursuing?
TBD, can get in touch with you, but we're going to meet literally after this to talk about it. So don't know yet. Depends on what the scope of them are.
Thank you.
And we'll make sure to keep, put the link for what's online now and then follow-up recap for this meeting.
Yeah, I have one more. I'm sorry, Kayla, if you talked about these and I missed it, but when you define a roadway that is, or miles that are comfortable for biking, for example, if you have a lane that has share the road or signage, marking on the pavement, or I don't know if you look only at something that is more like separated or not, but is that considered like comfortable or?
So we did, and that was one change that we did to the bicycle and pedestrian level of service, where there are some places throughout the region. I'll use the multi-use path around Magcatcher Parkway as an example, that it follows the roadway alignment. So I wouldn't consider that a greenway, but it's used as a biking and pedestrian facility, and it's got a lot of separation. So historically, the analysis didn't include multi-use paths. I'll tackle off-street first, but this time it did. For ones that followed roadway alignments. We didn't do it for greenways. Obviously, those are a little bit different, not impacted by traffic. For on-street facilities that are not a dedicated facility, the highway capacity manual does take into account like shoulder width, but it doesn't count it the same, if that makes sense. There are different factors associated, but we did not consider a Sharrow as an example. We did not consider that a bike facility. And it's not like you have to put a flag in the equation to say like this is or is not a facility. It just asks like, what is the bikeway width? What is the shoulder width outside the travel lane? What is the lane width that goes into it too? So if, for instance, you have in some rural areas, you have collectors that have 25-foot lanes, that does improve the bicycle level service, but it's not considered the same way as a bike facility. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that helps. I'm thinking more in urban areas, and from a transit perspective, when you have, people say, okay, so it's a transit shared or lane share with cyclists. I can say that our drivers probably don't love that.
Yeah.
But just.
So it would account in that case where if it's like a shared bus bike lane, as an example, the traffic volume would be so much lower than what a travel lane is on a general purpose lane. So it would be taken into account there. So you would probably see it be very high level service, like good level service, that is.
That helps, just trying to get an understanding of how they are evaluated.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's no trucks in there, so.
Any other questions, comments? That's why they call this the technical coordinating committee, I think, this particular topic. Very interesting. All right, that moves us on to our next informational item, cost estimation for the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. Some folks from CDM Smith will provide updates on all those costs. And we have some folks from Benesh here too. There's a Melody Butler on the agenda, but is my friend Chris Kirby going to present anything today? Where's he at? To you? Okay. All right.
Question.
Okay. Thank you.
My muscle. Hey everybody, I'm Melody Butler. As you said, I'm with CDM Smith. We have also been tasked with helping to update the RTP. And our task was to look at the cost estimates for roadway projects. So I'll just get right into it. So I'll quickly go through our methodology, point out some of the critical cost estimate components that we're seeing, show you the cost estimate tool, the TDOT cost estimate tool that we've used to do the construction costs, give a brief little status update, and talk about how we've also been coordinating with Benesh to include right-of-way and utility costs, and then show you just a brief glimpse of what the final submittal is going to be. So this is our methodology. First of all, we wanted to document the assumptions. So what we quickly realized when we got into all the applications is that they're not necessarily uniform in the information that's provided. So we wanted to go through and really document the assumptions that we could from all of the applications that would help feed our estimates with the tool. So we had a QC process, quality control process. So we documented our assumptions, and then for every assumption, we had someone go through and make sure that they looked reasonable. And then from there, we're able to populate the cost estimate tool. And then once those are populated and we have a cost estimate generated, someone else is also QCing that as well. So I'll walk through that real quick here. Oh no, there's no animation. So step one is that document assumptions. So this is our tracking spreadsheet that we had. So whenever the assumptions were documented in the folder, we clicked the check, they're ready, and then the person QCing those would know they're ready to look at and review. And so once those were ready to move on to populating, the next person knew based on the yes column, the first green column that you see, that they're ready to populate the tool. So then that designated estimator populates the cost estimate tool using those assumptions and documents the estimate in this tracker. And then from there, the assigned reviewer, who is different from the estimator, because we want to make sure it's an independent review, checks that the cost estimate looks reasonable, everything was entered in correctly, and check that it's complete. And then I know that it's ready to be sent off. So back to my point about documenting the assumptions, I have a couple of snapshots of some applications, not criticizing at all. These are just saying, these are some of the things that may have been missing that would have been nice to know to be able to maybe process this a little bit more quickly or automate the process in the future. So this is an intersection improvement project. And then the description said this will be a new signal and turn lanes. So sure, we can go with that. We can make a lot of assumptions, or we could dig down, go into Google Earth, figure out how many lanes there are now, how many we think there need to be, what kind of signal equipment may need to be used. If you need to widen the road, you need to think about a new mast arm. So things like that could be beneficial to know to do a cost estimate. So like I listed some more context needed. Existing lane geometry, proposed lane geometry, the right-of-way impacts, that would be helpful to generate, and then the equipment specifics. So here's another one. It's a new roadway. The description here is really good. It helped us figure out what the alignment needed to be and kind of what the expectation is for this project. But again, it's not easy to just filter out with some buttons or stuff that was entered into the form of the application. Like the length here, you probably can't see it, but it says not set. So we had no idea how long this project was to even start. So we went in and we documented where a new roadway would be aligned. But something else to consider here is it going to cross a stream? So will a culvert be needed? Will a bridge be needed? That really impacts your project costs. So those types of things are why we needed to dig in a little bit further and go through that documenting the assumptions process. So with that, some of the critical estimate components that maybe take note or needed in the application process would be the alignment length. That's a big one. Roadway width, the proposed and the existing, so we can do a comparison of how much more asphalt may be needed. The median type is important, whether there's curb and gutter, whether there's shoulders and how wide the shoulders are, if there are signals on the project as well, whether there's multi-modal facilities, and whether there's going to be a bridge or culvert, some sort of structure needed. But something else we ran into often was some of these extra contingencies are if there's streetscaping involved in the project, that's going to up the costs as well, but that's not necessarily a component that's within the cost estimate tool. So you have to assume some sort of contingency factor to accommodate the cost for that. And then a big one is railroad impacts. So if you happen to say you're widening a road that goes under a railroad bridge, well, that's going to be significant. So stuff like that really needs to be taken into account. So this is that cost estimate tool. I know it's tiny, but the components I just mentioned are what goes into this and feeds the estimate summary that was on the other page. So I'll just stop here and say we were tasked with construction costs only. So we did not look at right-of-way and utility costs. This is where our coordination with Benesh is coming in. So they were tasked with the right-of-way and utilities. And so what's going to happen at the end is we're going to combine our costs together and get a total project cost and compare that to what was in the application. One thing I will say is, and I'll go here. So we have part of that process is independently looking at the total project costs for 30 projects, which is 10% of the total number of projects we started with, just to get a good, reasonable idea of, are we approaching this similarly? In the end, when we combine our costs together, does it make sense? Will we get a reasonable cost? So that exercise is ongoing now. But this is our status update. So when we went through the assumption process, we did notice some projects that we just could not give a reasonable estimate for. Maybe it was something like ITS across 400 miles. I'm exaggerating, but we just couldn't come up with a way to say or give a reasonable cost estimate. So we pushed a few back to GNRC to look at a little more closely. So that was about 50 projects. We have completed and submitted 84 of our 313 minus 53 projects already. And so the remaining construction costs that we have is about 175, but all of those assumptions have already been documented. So kind of the grunt work has already been done. We just need to get through over the next couple of weeks the remaining construction costs. So what we are providing to GNRC is a project folder. So for each one of those projects, we've created a project folder. We have our assumptions documented. We have that cost estimate tool. We have the application that we use to make our assumptions. And we're giving that all to GNRC so that they can see what our assumptions were and just kind of verify that everything looks good. And then they could quickly tweak the cost estimate tool if they see something that they may not agree with. So that's what that is. And then finally, this is just a tracking spreadsheet of what we're gonna be submitting. So we have the project, the improvement type, the cost estimate from the application, our construction costs, and then we'll add in the right-of-way and utility costs for a combined total project costs, as I mentioned before. And then it'll be good to see the comparison between the application costs and what our calculated total estimate is. So that's our process. Any questions?
We'll have questions. I think we're going to plan to have questions for both of you guys once everybody gets done. Next up, we'll have Wally Blaine from Benesh.
Morning, everyone. Wally Blaine with Benesh. It's nice to see some familiar faces, but I know I'm new to most of you, so I'm glad to be here. Like Melody talked about, we were tasked with developing the right-of-way and utility cost construction or utility costs for the projects you've submitted for the RTP. Our approach was a little bit different in how we've approached this. We've taken this more from the perspective of how can we develop typical sections or models of projects to apply to, or models of roadways to apply to the projects. So I'll walk through what we came up with as far as project classifications, how we used some of the existing data to create those, what we've incorporated from the utility cost perspective, how we've developed some unit costs, what we did from the assessment and evaluation to come up with those unit costs, look at roadway typical sections, TDOT has come out most recently with the context typical sections. So drawing from some of that most recent information about what those project widths or elements, components could look like, and how that's feeding in primarily then for the right-of-way, what we're looking at for what would the future right-of-way width of projects be from an assessment. And then we've been coordinating with GNRC staff on some parcel-based data that helps give us some good information about values that we can then get an assessment from and convert to market conditions. And then I'll talk about where our remaining steps are, what we're doing as far as the coordination. So when we look at the project classifications, what we did is looked at the performance indicator data that really draws from the federal functional classifications that are somewhat very detailed. So you get rural minor collectors, rural minor arterials. We took the typical sections and kind of condensed those down for area types of urban, rural, and suburban. And then looked at 4 classifications of roadways, interstates, arterials, collectors, and local roads to create this matrix of 12 project classifications, area type, facility type mix. The table on the right, some small numbers, but we were able to classify what those projects, how they fell into the different categories. One of the ways that we kind of QC'd and reviewed that was to make sure we went back and looked at the urban area boundaries as well as municipalities and where there are incorporated areas to look at where rural and suburban lines kind of would mix in as well as with the urban area. So we're able to identify those projects and get the classification set up for how projects fall into those classifications. Based on that information, then we went through and sampled 10% in each of the area types, the classifications, to say how can we make sure that we're getting a sampling of data. So we did more of a desktop audit, looked at some existing data from project work about the types of utilities you would find within the right-of-ways of existing project classifications. So what's present on a rural arterial is different than an urban collector, for example. And we're able to build out unit costs at a per linear foot for each of those utilities. So that includes overhead power, either single phase or 3-phase, overhead and underground communications, wastewater, freshwater pipes as well, and gas infrastructure. One of the things that our team was able to incorporate on the water side as well was the presence of manholes and fire hydrants, other utility components, not just the pipes along the way. So looking at those representative list of projects within the classifications, we're able to then to convert those costs to linear foot and apply them to the project lengths. Just like Melody mentioned, from CDM Smith's perspective, some of the projects didn't have lengths, so we needed to pull in and kind of add up that information. We're still working through some of that, and that's one of those additional pieces that we'll still coordinate further to make sure where we're assuming lengths across both of us are consistent for all the projects. The other piece that we added to this, Melody talked about railroad on the construction side. We also incorporated and considered that on the utility side as well, because there's also utility coordination as well as hard infrastructure costs with that. So we did a GIS analysis again of each of the projects to identify existing railroad crossings. We know that some of the projects that you submitted are specifically railroad infrastructure projects, so those are going to take on a different flair. But the way we incorporated that, it was a per intersection railroad crossing cost that gets added on top of the utilities cost component. The next piece we did is to say those utility costs aren't always going to be the same for a multimodal infrastructure project as well as they are for a roadway widening project, right? You're going to have limited impacts. So we created this matrix of percentages for each of our project type classifications and each of the utility components. Allows us to make some adjustments on that. And then as the spreadsheet works, the calculations can be revised and updated for the projects in those categories. But it lets us be a little more fluid and flexible in how we're applying those utility costs at a grand scale across all the projects for the RTP. Moving towards the right-of-way side, then we took the elements that are included in the TDOT context typical sections and kind of built those out into what we would expect. So we did make some assumptions. The typical sections from TDOT have things like the lanes could be 10 to 12 feet in width. The median could be 14 to 24 feet in width. So we made some general assumptions about what would be included in those elements to make sure we're incorporating the presence of bicycle facilities, the presence of sidewalks or shared use paths. In the urban context, are they having on-street parking as elements? Those pieces together gave us some number or estimate of what the roadway width would be, if we want to call it that. We added another about 15% on top of that for the right-of-way, just to give us a little bit more width or in the area. We didn't get into some of the details that you get into when your projects are actually moving into production, like presence of water management facilities if you need ponds and the like. So certainly those are things that are tweaks to make onto this. But the idea was to say, if we are looking at a 4-lane urban arterial, what are the elements that are in there and what should our right-of-way width be? Most of the projects came in when they were needed to have an existing number of lanes and a future number of lanes. We've also had to go in and look at some of the aerials and do some review of projects where we didn't have that information to say what is there. Because even on the multimodal projects where it's just adding a sidewalk, we want to make sure that we're looking at what would that ultimate design typical section be for determining what is the right of way that's needed. We didn't have information or we were able to consider existing right of way to know what is actually needed, but we'll be able to overlay that with the parcel data to see, this is what's needed. The outcome of that, which I'm probably jumping ahead, will be to have some GIS data that associates your project IDs with the folio numbers on the impacted parcels from an overall assessment. So not a glamorous slide here with the bullets on how we're applying this, but it definitely is from a GIS perspective, being able to buffer our projects based on those right-of-way widths. So we take a step back to that spreadsheet with those typical sections where each project based on classification has a width. We're able to buffer individual projects using those widths and overlay those with the parcel data to get a percentage of the parcel impacted. We'll be looking at parcels that are greatly impacted and determining, well, we want to consider that at a higher cost of the full parcel, not just a partial taking of what the impacted area is, and then be able to summarize that based on the land cost by project and provide that information. So next steps to complete is creating these summaries. So from a utility cost summary over there on the right, we were able to back in with the costs that are calculated off of those assumptions as kind of a final review and sensitivity testing. What is the average cost per mile within the projects in the different categories and how that lines up? It did cause us to go back and make some revisions in the assumptions that we had initially for especially on the new roadway projects. We lowered down some of those percentages of impact for those. So continuing to go through that, we've got I'll say a handful, but about 80 projects still where we're reviewing the number of lanes and the project lengths and getting that information updated so we can continue to apply that in the model. Looking at and again, reviewing those cost calculations, the review of the right of way. Once we get through all that, the big question is on intersection projects. So looking at not all intersection projects really are going to have a right of way impact, but we don't want to necessarily say zero at this planning level stage. We want to have some kind of commitment. So that's a big piece to try and to work through and understand on the intersection side. Again, that coordination with CDM Smith. One of Melody's slides showed those 30 projects. So we're beginning the process of doing the review and construction cost on those 30 projects as they'll be working on the utility right-of-way side on those. And then final step, then finalizing our estimates for the projects and turning those back over to Daniel and GNRC staff. Again, as Melody talked about on the cost side, we're building out our table again based on projects to have utility costs and right-of-way costs. So that all that'll be integrated in together once it's done.
Yep. All right, we'll open it up for questions now for Melody and Wally. Does anybody have any questions for these guys? Second.
I have a quick question. How are you classifying suburban, differentiating from urban and rural?
Yeah, one of the things that we looked at from the suburban side was to say, where are places that are outside the urbanized area, but in the city limits, incorporated city limits. We also had some areas where we kind of just went through and reviewed and said, this is the urbanized area is not a smooth boundary. It jogs around. So are there areas that are kind of in between and looking at those? We certainly have some maps that we've produced for review, but we can pass those along for everyone else to kind of review and give us some feedback on this also.
PDOT has a project scoping guide that lists 5 contexts. I was wondering if you considered using that.
We had hoped to get the urban core, urban, suburban, rural, and rural town context areas. That was kind of the driver in a lot of this. What we found is we weren't able to get that information at the project roadway level. So we kind of defaulted back to just the 3.
Any other questions?
On the 30 projects that you sent back to GNRC, what was again, the reason for those? And is it more information that was needed? Or,
Oh, the ones we pushed back that
Yes.
aren't, yeah, there just wasn't enough information. Some of them were actually completed already from what we could tell. So that's part of it too, but yeah.
So I remember some of the ones that came up were BRT corridors, having not great tools to estimate those, which we may be in touch with you about. We may offer some guidance on assumptions to go back and relook at those. So I think it was a variety of things like that. Yeah.
Any questions or comments? This is great, guys. I don't remember this kind of a process going, last time we went through this. I don't remember this kind of detail on the cost estimations. It seemed a whole lot more like, throw something up there and see if it sticks a little bit more. At least that was my perspective. And so I think this is,
And with
This
the
is
rise
great.
in costs, it's just like, we really have to pay more attention. And I forgot to mention that the TDOT tool has been updated in recent years to reflect those rises in costs.
And I think I told most of the folks at the county workshops, but this helps to get a second look at your projects and helps with our fiscal constraint and our RTP. But with the detail that these folks are going into, we hope it can also be a resource to you to have better planning estimates as you get into really trying to get through the process and get these constructed. So we're going to make all of this material available to you for the long term, as you know.
any other questions or comments? All right, thanks, guys. That was excellent. Okay. That moves us on to regular reports. First up is TDOT report, Mr. Stacy Morrison.
Or one last time, you have to make me squirm, John. So statewide partnership, those are currently in review. Statewide, a little over 60 projects, about half of those were within the Nashville MPO. So we will sit down and review those, get some feedback from the MPO staff. We'll look at, where those projects are in long-range plans across the state and as part of our review process. But ongoing, we'll continue to provide information on those as well. Our planning grants are still open. That closes on Halloween this month. So you got 30 more days for those. So if you do have questions on submitting your applications, my staff, myself, we're available to answer any questions that you all may have for our planning grant round this year. So this is our, I think we've had over 150 projects in our planning grant. So it's been very popular, and I'm sure it will continue to be that. But again, if you have questions, please let me know. Have any questions for me?
Questions for TDOT? No, thanks, Stacy. That moves us on to the chair's report. That's me. As far as report business before the body, I don't have much, but I do an announcement. A lot of y'all may know already. I've accepted a position with the University of Tennessee as the first executive director for their new Center for Local Planning. Today's actually my last day on the job with Sumner County. And so I'll be starting there on October the 13th. And so as y'all may know, it's a brand new thing that's being set up over at UT. The legislature's provided some funding for it. So it'll be a work in progress, kind of building the train as it rolls down the tracks, I think, but I'm really looking forward to it. I look forward to working with all you guys in the future as well, continuing that relationship. And today, I made a joke about this as the technical coordinating committee. Obviously, I'm humbled every time I come to one of these meetings, just the amount of intelligence that comes from all over the region to these meetings. There's a lot of smart people in this room. I've had an opportunity to go to every MPO meeting in the whole state and different roles I've had in the past. And without a doubt, this is by far the most engaged MPO in the state. And it's got some of the smartest and most capable people as well. It's been an honor working with you in this capacity, and I look forward to working with y'all in the future. And I appreciate the staff at GNRC as well. They're doing a fantastic job. I think they've made a lot of progress. They're doing a lot of things, a lot more. They're doing a lot of things in a very data-driven way and including everybody in the process. I think it's fantastic. And I want to call out Miss Lou particularly as well, for her role and, everything she does behind the scenes to make things roll. And so it's folks like Miss Lou that make the world go round. So appreciate her. That's all I have, and I'll turn it over to the staff, to Daniel for the staff.
Thank you, Josh, and we really appreciate you too. We're gonna, we'll do our typical staff report, and then we do want to take another minute to recognize Josh. And I didn't realize you planned your last day around TCC, so thank you for doing that.
It worked out that way. Dedication.
I'll turn it over to Taylor for the tip status report.
Morning, everybody. No big news. Status report be the last obligation we have, so the third, which is our last, or before our last TCC. So there's no new obligations to report. Today is the first, so we usually get those in the next 4 or 5 days. So for November 1st, or the beginning of November TCC, we'll have an updated obligation report, and probably another one for TVB as well, depending on what we have. What I want to call our attention to is that we did get all of our modifications and amendments that were processed May and through July and August, submitted to DOT and sent to FHW, approved before their internal deadline for extra obligation, 12th of September. So those were all submitted, approved. The funding obligation, everyone was coordinated when I got those approvals. So hopefully you guys can get emails, things of that nature about your subsequent obligations. One other note, we have no amendments this month, but next month we have our next cycle. Right now, most of those amendments are for fiscal year 25 SPP projects that are being either state money being added just to reflect those awards and maybe either addition state funds or state management of the project moving from locals. So that's the biggest thing we have right now in our amendment cycle for November. But if you got anything, please give to me probably at least a week before. That would be great. That we have it prepared for our TCC meeting to get it on there. But that's kind of what we have lined up for amendments for next month. If you have any questions regarding status report amendments, transmittal FHCP, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Taylor? I want to commend Taylor on his mustache as well.
My daughter just laughed at me, so. Sure.
Upcoming meetings, always like to give you a preview of what's coming up. We have the regional council body. Since we do not have the TPP this month, we'll be highlighting Cybersecurity Awareness Month and general updates on regional activities and grant opportunities. November 5th, we'll meet here again, and this will be an exciting meeting because we'll have the first draft of our 2050 RTP and the proposed tip that we're working to update as well. And then the Transportation Policy Board on November 19th, where we will carry those topics forward for the draft of the RTP and the tip as well. All right. And with that, thank you for your service. Chair Josh Sudith. Well, Michael, do you want to?
Thank you, Daniel. Well, Josh, we wanted to show our appreciation to you for your leadership on transportation issues across Middle Tennessee as chair of the TCC. I think for everybody's benefit, I think it's important to note a couple of your accomplishments. I think most notably.
Let me know what those are so I can write those down.
You've already landed your next job, but I don't know about but I think most notably, you brought to this committee first ever bylaws, organizational bylaws that helps define roles and responsibilities for the partnership that sits around the table. I think also notable as an accomplishment is that as a part of the bylaws development, we expanded the membership of the committee to include the local government partners, but also dedicated seats for transportation-related agencies, both at the state and federal government and across the region, and then a new opportunity for at-large members to be appointed to this committee by the TCC chair or the TPP chair to represent special interests or topics that we want to incorporate into conversations about transportation in Middle Tennessee. And this was all because of your leadership and your direction to staff. We bring some additional organization clarity to the TCC. So I want to thank you for that and just otherwise show our appreciation for the partnership that we began with you while you were at TDOT and that we will continue with you in your new role at UT. So thank you. And I think Jonathan probably has a few words to say on behalf of the TCC in terms of the role that you will be stepping into in the coming months.
Yeah, my coup is complete, so I've now overthrown Josh. So yeah, no, I appreciate the leadership you've shown. I just echo the words that Michael's shown, and I've only had to step in as vice chair a handful of times. I will remind you that the first time I stepped in, we did have a public comment. So I'll throw that out there. You know, we rarely have public comments, but you know, so throw that out there.
Didn't
for
earn
you,
your
but-
paycheck that.
Yeah, I had to earn it that time. We had a public comment, so we did that just, to make sure we're in compliance with the FHWA. So, but thank you for everything and wish you well and good choice on the UT. Hope to see a lot of orange.
Absolutely. Y'all be careful. You're going to have an actual engineer in charge of the TCC now. So things could get crazy. Thank y'all very much, though. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Dang. All right, I guess that's back on me. And is there any other business to come before the TCC? Hearing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn. I said something and second.